that radical LGBTQ movement.
LGBTQ.
It's insanity.
Totally insane.
It actually seems like a mental disorder at this point.
Transgenderism.
Extremism.
Something that's very new and involves children.
Newsflash. Being queer is not new. Also not new? Queer folks fighting for their rights. The controversy and the debates in the public square that are happening right now represent just one little point on a long, long timeline. But how much do you know about that fascinating timeline? And what does patriarchy have to do with it? Some folks who are scandalized by queerness
Where's my straight flag?
Why am I constantly getting
Where is my straight flag?
might be surprised to learn about some of their favorite figures from history. Were you surprised by any of those? I was. That's because our culture is what sociologists call heteronormative, which is a worldview that promotes heterosexuality as the normal or preferred sexual orientation. And it also means that we assume that everyone is cisgender and heterosexual. This can mean that many queer people don't feel comfortable being their true selves in public, which of course is terribly unhealthy for them, and also perpetuates the illusion that everyone around us is cisgender and straight. So why has our culture historically been heteronormative? Well, the Bible. There are several passages in the Bible that condemn homosexuality, though let's dig into this a little bit with my friend Dan McClellan.
Hey everybody, I'm Dan McClellan. I'm a scholar of the Bible and religion. There are passages in the Hebrew Bible and in the New Testament that prohibit and condemn same-sex intercourse. But anciently, they didn't have a concept of a same-sex orientation because they didn't organize their understanding of sexuality around a framework of sexual orientation. That's something we've developed only since the 19th century. Anciently, they organized their understanding of sexuality around a social hierarchy of domination with different roles and different positions in that hierarchy. And so sex was not conceptualized as an activity mutually engaged in by two equal partners. It could not be. That was inappropriate. Sex was something that a dominant, active sexual agent did to a submissive, passive sexual object. Sexual agency only flowed downstream, so you had to be higher up on that hierarchy, acting upon someone lower down on that hierarchy. And this is why the Hebrew Bible prohibits and condemns male same-sex intercourse, because that was the person who was supposed to be at the top of that hierarchy taking a submissive, lower position on that hierarchy.
Well, that's interesting. And what's the name of that hierarchy where some men have status over all the other men for various reasons and all women because they're women? Patriarchy. Of course, the passages of the Bible forbidding homosexual sex have been interpreted to forbid all kinds of other things. If men exhibit any feminine traits at all, that plummets the man's status in society. And if you notice a feeling of disdain when you see a man acting in a way that your society says is for women, that's internalized misogyny. But patriarchy doesn't really like two women together either.
Lesbians.
While it may elevate a woman's status to be seen as masculine in some ways, just look at what women do to be taken seriously at the office, for example. You definitely don't want to be an actual lesbian in a heteronormative society. Lesbians can bring up all kinds of scary questions for patriarchal men. What do you mean you don't need men? Who even are we if we don't have anyone to preside over? And even more darkly, how dare you usurp the place of a man in the social, religious, and economic hierarchy? But other cultures around the world have chosen to account for the variety in gender and sexual orientation in different ways, accepting this variety as a normal part of human diversity, and in some cases, even celebrated. For example, in some Indigenous American communities, individuals who identify as two-spirit are seen as gifted because they carry two spirits with them, both male and female. Two-spirit folks are often the healers, medicine people, and visionaries within their communities. Being able to see with double vision, being able to see both through the masculine and feminine lens, is considered a great gift. Now, there are some patriarchal societies that have allowed for homosexual relationships, notably ancient Greece and ancient Rome, where same-sex relationships were common. But, as Professor McClellan mentioned, they still operated within hierarchical models. Interestingly, though, there was a ceremony in early Eastern Christianity called adelphopoiesis, meaning literally brother-making, which allowed two people, usually men, of the same sex to be united together by the church. It was thought of as a sibling relationship, but you can't tell me that there wasn't also some monkey business going on. Anyway, by the time Christianity took over Europe, laws were based on the Bible, which included a prohibition against sodomy. By about 1300, homosexual activity was criminalized in most of Europe, and in 1533 in England, Henry VIII made same-sex activity punishable by hanging. Apparently, committing adultery with countless women and having your wives murdered was a-okay, though. English pilgrims and colonists brought this attitude with them to America, and male homosexuality in all 13 colonies was punishable by death. Interestingly, women's sexuality wasn't legislated, maybe because under the laws of coverture, women weren't really citizens and didn't count as people. The only known record of a woman getting into trouble for same-sex action was in 1649 in Plymouth Colony, when Sarah White Norman and Mary Vincent Hammond were prosecuted for, quote, lewd behavior with each other upon a bed. Luckily, the charges were dropped. Seriously, though, in 1779, Thomas Jefferson proposed a law that said, whosoever shall be guilty of rape, polygamy, or sodomy with man or woman shall be punished if a man by castration, if a woman by cutting through the cartilage of her nose a hole of 1/2 inch diameter at the least. Luckily, this did not become law, but it reveals people's attitudes at the time. Some states began eliminating the death penalty for sodomy throughout the 18th and 19th centuries, but only for white people. In the South at the time, enslaved people could still be executed for sodomy. In the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, America got swept up in an era of almost panicked homophobia.
Do you want your son enticed into the world of homosexuals, or your daughter lured into lesbianism?
The CBS News survey shows that 2 out of 3 Americans look upon homosexuals with disgust, discomfort, or fear.
One never knows when the homosexual is about. He may appear normal, so keep with your group, and don't go off alone with strangers.
This was interesting for me to learn about because this is the time period that my grandparents were adults, and my parents' generation absorbed this homophobia big time. FBI and police departments kept lists of known homosexuals in the establishments they frequented. The U.S. Post Office kept track of the addresses where material pertaining to homosexuality was mailed. Cities performed sweeps in neighborhoods, parks, bars, and beaches to get rid of LGBTQ people. Universities expelled instructors suspected of being homosexual. In 1950, President Eisenhower issued an executive order to root out homosexuals and other sex perverts in government. In 1952, homosexuality was listed in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, or DSM, as a sociopathic personality disorder. And the United States passed an anti-immigration law banning those with psychopathic personalities from immigrating, including queer folks. The LDS Church also conducted these witch hunts. I recently learned that the man tasked with surveillance of a Salt Lake City bathhouse to catch and punish gay men was my great-grandfather. Police would violently raid gay bars and harass and blackmail patrons, threatening to ruin their lives if they didn't pay bribes. They would use the infamous 3-item rule, arresting anyone who was wearing fewer than 3 items of gender-appropriate clothing. One bright spot during this era was in 1961, when Illinois became the first state to rescind its anti-sodomy laws. But it would take decades for other states to follow suit. It was in this era that queer folks started banding together and fighting back. And as we know from other social movements trying to make change, sometimes it's hard for activists to work together because sometimes they have different methods and sometimes even different goals. This was the case for queer activists in the 20th century who were divided into 2 main camps: assimilationists and liberationists. Assimilationists, as you can tell from their name, had the goal of being accepted and assimilated into cisgender heterosexual society. Assimilationists were represented by the Mattachine Society, who were largely white, middle-class, educated men.
Very simply, the Mattachine Society is an organization dedicated to mutual understanding between society and the homosexuals.
Liberationists, on the other hand, wanted liberation from cisgender heterosexual norms. This branch of activists were bohemians, thinkers, public intellectuals, some middle-class white folks, but also poor folks and people of color. Contrary to assimilationists, they didn't really have much power in society that they needed to protect and hang on to. So they had less to lose from being more radical, which brings us to Greenwich Village, New York in the summer of 1969.
The sleepy village called Greenwich.
The Stonewall Inn was one of the most popular gay bars in New York at the time. It was actually owned by the Genovese crime family of the New York Mafia, who bribed the police to look the other way regarding their clientele. But even so, Stonewall was raided about once a month, and LGBTQ folks were constantly harassed and arrested. In the early hours of June 28, 1969, one of these raids occurred, and people decided that they had had enough, and they started throwing bottles and shot glasses at the police. The police locked themselves into the building. Protesters threw in a firebomb. Police used tear gas and beat up the rioters. The mob grew to thousands, sparking smaller riots all throughout the city. And pretty soon, this uprising had sparked the gay liberation movement. A year later, the queer community celebrated the 1-year anniversary of the Stonewall riot, and this commemoration eventually grew to become Pride Month in June. And that brings us to the end of part 1. I think my biggest takeaway today is the concept that humans create culture, and then culture creates humans. Thousands and thousands of years ago, in one part of the world, people looked at members of their communities who were a little different, and they said, they're special, or no big deal, here's how they'll fit into our community. Those humans created a culture where the norm was acceptance, and then the next generations of humans were taught to see their queer family members as valuable members of their communities. Thousands of years ago, in another part of the world, people looked at members of their communities who were a little different and said, they're bad. They're so bad we should punish them or even kill them. Then that cultural norm got passed down, and the next generations of humans were taught to hate their own family and community members. Humans create culture, and then culture creates humans. The good news is, we can start over and create a new cultural norm anytime we want, changing course for future generations. We'll learn more about that next time. What were your takeaways from today's video? Tell me in the comments and then forward this video on to a friend.